Good evening. We'll begin tonight with addressing this week's parasha. According to the new triennial cycle, we're going to be reading what's commonly known as the beginning of Parashath Yithro. It begins as Shmoth, I think, 18. Let me just confirm that on my screen. Uh, yes, it's right about there. It's the entire 18th parak and a little bit of what they refer to as the 19th parak. And I found this is interesting because I think there's a deep connection between what we are now reading and what they are going to be reading in the ubiquitous uh, Babylonian cycle, the 1 year cycle with which we're all familiar. I say ubiquitous because it's become so common that it's almost associated with a fact of the Jewish calendar. It's in the Shulchan Aruch, and people refer to a particular date as, let's say, the Tuesday of Parshas Baloscha. That's what today would be in many people's minds. People refer to Bar Mitzvah Parshas because they know once a child is born, what parasha they'll be reading 13 years after that in the common cycle. I think these two parashiyot are intricately connected, so it's good that I don't consider this a coincidence. Hold on one second. I'm having a problem here on the screen, something just popping up. Where is the Zoom window? There we are. Okay. So first of all, we have to address some of the major issues that the Mefarshim, the classical commentators, address that present themselves right at the beginning. The first is the matter of Yithro, that would be Jethro's arrival at the Israelite camp. It says that he came to where they were encamping. It actually uses a singular. It refers to Yisrael, the Jewish people of Israel. And it says, Asher hu chonesh sham har Elohim. He was encamping there at the mountain of God. Har Elohim is a reference to Mount Sinai. Onkelos translates that as, or he renders it as, the mountain on which God revealed himself. So that's why it's Horev is already called, Mount Horeb is already called right at the beginning of the book of Exodus, the same thing, God's mountain, and Onkelos calls it there, the mountain on which God revealed himself. And if you look at the previous narrative, the Israelites were in a place called Rephidim. And then we read in the 19th parak, I'll just look it up, the next parak of what we will be reading, it says that they came to Mount Sinai after leaving Rephidim. And here we have it that they're already at Mount Sinai. So it seems that this parasha is intentionally or explicitly out of the chronological order. Now, there's this principle that a lot of the Torah and large parts of the rest of the Bible are not written in strictly chronological order. If you're reading through the book from start to finish, you'll encounter episodes that happened out of chronological order. Sometimes it's not so clear. Rashi uses that principle more than others. He invokes it to, smooth over some textual difficulties as he saw them. Other Mefarshim, especially the Ramban, disagree with his utilization sometimes of that principle. But here, it seems that it's pretty clear that he did come after the Israelites arrived at Sinai. Considering that they were very busy in the days leading up to the revelation, when they received the Torah from God at Sinai, it was only a matter of days. The events do not seem to fit in there. It says that the Yithro, for example, saw that the people are standing over Moses from morning until evening. It could be that that can't be. Sorry, let's just scratch that. It seems very much from this description that not only did he arrive at Sinai after the Israelites arrived at Sinai, he arrived there quite later, specifically after they had even received the Torah, and all the events as described in the ensuing parashiyot until basically the beginning of the construction of the Mishkan, which Chazal place, using a careful reading of the text, they place in the fall. If the Jewish people arrived at Sinai on the first day of Siwan, says that's when what we call Siwan, which would be the first of the third month, and the entire matter of the golden calf, they finally achieved forgiveness on the 10th of Tishrei, and that's when Moses came down and began to tell them about how to build the Mishkan. Yithro's arrival is placed quite late. Perhaps it's even aside from the fact that the book of Exodus ends with the erection of the tabernacle and how they first began the service there. We find that the arrival of Yithro is basically the second to last event described in this book, chronologically speaking. So that's a little bit that's a little bit of a difficulty. The question then is, why would the Torah put Yithro's arrival over here if it's so chronologically not in place? Until now, basically everything we've read about in this book has been in chronological order for the most part. I think maybe you can make an argument there. Some things, for example, in the early Parashiot, one or two things that might not be in chronological order. That's not what we're going to discuss tonight. The fact that Yithro's arrival and his activities and his significant contribution to the Torah is placed here is asking us to try to understand that. Next, the whole idea of appointing judges. Yithro gives Moshe Rabbeinu an idea. He tells him that it's not good that he's the one who basically is consulted on all matters of the Torah. That's basically what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying. He's saying that everybody's standing over him from morning until evening, and there's just not enough. And Yithro realizes that it's going to drain Moshe Rabbeinu. He's going to be burned out too soon if he keeps up this system. And we're familiar with the system that he then advised Moses to put in place. And this, as many has pointed out, seems to contradict what we read about right at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy. Right in the first chapter, Moshe Rabbeinu begins to talk and says that it's very hard for me to deal with such a large people on my own. And he describes how he cried out to God, how can I bear this burden entirely by myself? And then it says that he decided that he was going to basically appoint a system of judges as almost described in this week's parasha. So it seems to be described in the same episode, except now Moshe Rabbeinu, instead of giving credit to his father-in-law, he's taking the credit for himself. And the Mefarshim also deal with this one. There are some resolutions that are intricate. I think they're quite clever. You could read them. For example, of that of Ramban, the Nachmanides, and the Abarbanel, the Malbim. They have their answers. I always like the answer that says that what Moshe Rabbeinu is describing at the end of the Torah in Deuteronomy, in Devarim, where he describes how he appointed judges on his own, is not referring to anything that happened in the parasha we have in front of us, Yithro, but is describing something in Ba'alothecha. That is, the sages point out that once the Jewish people left Mount Sinai, as we will read in the common parasha this week in Parashath Ba'alothecha, they left Sinai, and then they ended up in a place where they were burned for complaining. It says there was the people were mithonanim, Rabbeinu Hashem. They were evil in the eyes of God. Wativ arbam ish Hashem, and a fire of God burned among them. Watochal b'ktzei hamachaneh, and it devoured at the edges of the camp. B'ktzei hamachaneh, and Chazal say that ktzei is from the word the katzin, the leaders of the people. Excuse me for a minute. And the issue is, they say that the Ketzinim refers to the leadership. For example, we find that suddenly, right after this, Moshe Rabbeinu is complaining to God that he is left without any other elders. He has to appoint a whole new, the whole new set of 70 elders. Until this point, we have already read about it, the fact how the Jewish people, even before they left Egypt, right at the beginning of the story of the Exodus, when Moshe Rabbeinu first came back to Egypt to deliver the message of the redemption, there were already elders of Israel. There were 70 elders already at the revelation at Sinai. And it seems very strange that suddenly there'd be no 70 elders, or any other leadership for that matter. Until the Parashath Ba'alothecha, at least until the second half, in every parasha, until that point, in the book of Bamidbar, we come across a list of 12 tribal leaders, the common Nisiim, and they have quite well-known names. Foremost among them, Machon ben Aminadav, leader of the tribe of Yehuda, and brother-in-law of Aharon. So it seems strange that suddenly these 12 Nisiim are no longer around. And Chazal say, indeed, this is when they all died. They were the ones who perished in this plague right after the Jewish people left Sinai. And there is also traditions that that's indeed when Machon ben Aminadav died in the second year from leaving Egypt. So this would explain why it is that Chazal, why Chazal understood that word to be referring to the leadership, and why Moshe Rabbeinu was suddenly left without any Nesiim. As a matter of fact, I like to say that this describes a major power vacuum, considering that the 12 tribal leaders are suddenly no more, the 70 elders are suddenly no more, and there's a new leadership. And then, shortly thereafter, just a matter of weeks later, 12 more outstanding individuals from the caliber of 12 of two of the known spies who were sent to spy out the land. You can understand the caliber of the rest of them. 12, there's 10 of them with whom we are unfamiliar with out of this context, but 2 of them are Kalev and Yehoshua. Yehoshua himself is Moses' successor and assistant, and the grandson of the first leader of the tribe of Ephraim, the second most dominant tribe in Israel after the tribe of Yehudah. And Kalev himself is a cousin of Nachshon ben Aminadav, grandfather of the people who were, of the man who was in charge of building the Mishkan, married himself to Miriam, according to one understanding in Divrei Yamim. So you understand that these are people also who are pretty much up there in the hierarchy of our ancestral society. And they are no more also. 10 of them die in a plague shortly after coming back from spying out the land. So you could understand that this power vacuum is what led to what eventually would be the rebellion, the intended rebellion of Korach, who himself was a big shot, and Dathan and Aviram, who are among the Kriyei Da. It means those are the people who are called to, I guess, the town meeting when decisions had to be made. And we also know that those are the same people who are eventually the 70 elders, for example. The new 70 elders are taken from the same group of people who had served as taskmasters, in Egypt. They're the ones who earned that. Their compassion for their fellow Israelites in the servitude is what basically marked them for promotion. So we're losing leadership left and right, and it leads up to Korach and then another 250 prominent people. A cousin of Moshe Rabbeinu and Dathan and Aviram, who himself are pretty prominent, are all gone. And this is something that the book sort of skims over, or I wouldn't say even skim. The book alludes to without saying explicitly, because the Torah doesn't want to say everything that reflects negatively on us. But there was a power vacuum nonetheless, and that is basically what is described by Moshe Rabbeinu in the book of Devarim, right at the beginning. Why did he appoint? Yithro had originally told him to appoint a system of judges. That was all well and good, and that basically lasted for a few months. If Yithro shows up, perhaps maybe Tishrei or Cheshvan after the revelation at Sinai, then suddenly you have this power vacuum in the end of Parashath Ba'alothecha, basically around ER. That's when he has to start again. So Moshe Rabbeinu does that. So I don't think there's any discrepancy there. But then, once we're already in Parashath Ba'alothecha, we come to something else that seems to contradict this week's parasha. By this week, once again, the triangular cycle. It says that Moshe Rabbeinu, right before the Jewish people left Sinai, or it's actually in the middle of the description, it says they left, and then Moshe Rabbeinu had to speak to someone, and then it describes how the ark was traveling before the people, and Moshe Rabbeinu had his own special prayer, 2-verse prayer to say when the ark would first take off and then would come to rest, a prayer with which we are familiar. And then it starts the story about how people began to die in a plague once they got to the next station after Sinai. And this description is that Moshe Rabbeinu is suddenly speaking once again to Hovav ben Ru'el HaMidyani Chothein Moshe. He's speaking to Hobab, the son of Ru'el, the Midianite, who is the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu. And this is a little bit difficult because what we are reading now in the triennial cycle just says that Moshe Rabbeinu sent off his father-in-law, and he went back to his land. Yet suddenly, the Jewish people are leaving Sinai, and Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking again to his father-in-law. This guy is this gentleman guy. Hovav ben Ru'el seems to have the same father as Yithro. He just has a different name suddenly. It should be Yithro if Moshe Rabbeinu only has one father-in-law, unless he has 2 wives from 2 men who are brothers. It's Hovav. Some have said Hovav is not Yithro, it's his brother. And they're both Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law. Ruel is Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law. It seems the basic understanding is that Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to his father-in-law and trying to convince him to come with the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And he's explaining why it would be good for him to follow them. And there is no resolution. Originally, this Chovav seems intent on leaving. Moshe Rabbeinu gives good arguments for why he should stay, and there is no resolution. So this seemingly contradicts what we read in Parashath Yithro. And once again, in Yithro, Moshe Rabbeinu sends off his father-in-law, and he goes home, goes back to his land. And in Ba'alothecha, Moshe Rabbeinu has to try to speak to his father-in-law, get him to stay, and it's inconclusive. So now we see that there's these two central facets of our short parasha, which hark back to Parashath Yithro. Which Ba'alothecha is connected to Yithro, and Yithro is connected to Ba'alothecha. The matter of that we see Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law, both of them, having a role there. Moshe Rabbeinu actually considers him quite important. And the idea of appointing judges. In this week's parasha, Moshe Rabbeinu appoints judges because, not because out of necessity, but on the advice of his father-in-law. And in Ba'alothecha, Moshe Rabbeinu has to appoint 70 new elders because of a sudden necessity. The elders he had are suddenly gone. He has to appoint new ones. So we're left with a real conundrum. But I think that when you see a suspicious thing like this, I reminded of what Rabbi Soloveitchik used to say about Bible criticism. Bible criticism, especially that of the people who deny, let's say, the divinity of the Torah, find what's called doublets, incidences like these, narratives that seem to be describing the same event. Two narratives describe one event, and there's differences. There are critical differences showing that these two events cannot be the same. And then they say that indeed they're trying to describe one event, and they're written by different time periods or by different people with different agendas, and they take apart the entire Torah. For example, they take apart our 5 books of Moses and basically say that must have been multiple writers. The final editor didn't know what he was doing. He left in these inherent contradictions, and that's it. And you don't really learn much from that. Instead, you can maybe make guesses about ancient Israelite society and how we were actually idolaters and not monotheistic and other such nonsense. But like Rabbi Soloveitchik said, I don't believe that. And for the simple reason that I've written some poetry before, and I've shown people how to do this with actual events that they've lived through. You could take two similar events and describe them very similarly. And then someone will say, like, oh, you must be describing one event from two different viewpoints or two different sources, and they both do not know what they're talking about. I use the example of, let's say, the Israeli elections in 2013 and 2015, which used basically many of the same characters, same people were running, and the results were radically different. One resulted in a government that basically collapsed after 2 years, and another resulted in a government that also didn't last so long, but was very different. In the first one, for example, Lapid was part of the government, and the second one, he was not, and other critical differences. So if I wrote those in a poetic style and made the verses line up with each other, you would think I'm just writing about one event and I just can't decide which source I'm using. But that's not true. The Torah actually is describing multiple events sometimes and trying to focus on their similarities. And it's not trying to intentionally confuse us and show us that there's a bad editor here. It's actually just trying to show that certain events are connected, that there's a thematic lesson that needs to be learned here. And then you look deeper into this week's parasha, and you find something that actually sheds light on the fact that this arrival of Yithro is so out of chronological order and had to be put into the narrative where it was because of a lesson that we find from a reflective pattern in between these two books. Normally, we have chiastic structures. If you haven't seen what a chiastic structure is in the Bible, I ask you to go back to previous lectures I have online and also some things I've written, or to look. There's a very nice article in the Hakira Journal by Rabbi Schwartz, the most recent one. Go look at that. Go to hakira.org, you'll see it. This is something that scholars, good, faithful scholars, have shown from the beginning, that the Torah has certain structures. And in this case, we actually don't have a real chiasm. A real chiasm is in one narrative where part A, part B, part C reflects, and then CBA is reiterated. And there are many parashiot that are like that. It's an internal chiasm. In this case, we see a structure in the book of Exodus that is then recapitulated in the book of Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers. And it's not really chiasm only because there's an intervening book. There's most of the book of Exodus, and then all of Vayikra, Leviticus, and then the beginning of Bamidbar before we get to this recapitulation. And I'd like to share that with you right now. I've color-coded it. If I can see how I can share the screen. Let me see. Reactions, record, share screen. Here we go. Okay, can you please enable my screen sharing? Okay, I'm going to try it. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay. I need who's the official host?
One second, I'll give you a second.
Yes, sir. Okay, let me see this. This is something that I'm very happy about, actually, because it explains.
Try now?
Okay, I will try now. Give me a second. Okay, so I've tried to make this as visible as possible. Tell me if you can read the whole thing. I'm going to enlarge it as best I can. Can everybody read this? Nice and visible? I color-coded it to explain how the major events leading up to Parashath Yithro are then recapitulated in reverse in leading up to Parashath Beha'alothecha and beyond. The first is an interesting prologue. What the end of Parashath Bo, we see that God gives the Israelites commandments that they're to observe when the Lord shall bring you to the land of the Canaanite. There are two parashiot which have this key phrase, Vaya ki v'yacha Hashem Elokecha el haaretz asher, etc. And what are the main commandments of those parashiot? Two of them, both are Vaya ki v'yacha, are the parashiot of Tefillin. Tefillin is the major, let's say, dress of the Israelite. A proper Jew wears tefillin. That's how he sticks out. It's not a yarmulke, it's not a beard and peyot. Really, how we do not cut our hair the way like the Gentiles do is a negative. You're not supposed to do like them. It doesn't say have a beard or have some hair over here. It means don't shave it away the way the Gentiles would. At least that's the way the Rambam understands it. Whereas tefillin and tzitzit are positive aspects. Make sure you're wearing tefillin. That's the sign of the covenant. And make sure you have these fringes on your garments. So the parashiot of tefillin are there. They're ubiquitous. They're the garment, basically. Or better yet, later in the book of Exodus, they are the ornament of the Jewish people. They're the sign of the covenant. They make us different. So that's a prologue. And then we get to the beginning of Exodus. The Jewish people leave the Jewish people are finally on their way to the Holy Land. There's a detour. They cannot, hold on one second. I can't read all this because I have our pictures over here, so I'm going to make those go away. The Jewish people have a detour, and it's so that they don't encounter the Philistines. It prolongs their journey, and then they're faced with a clear and present danger. It's true. They really thought Pharaoh was going to run them into the sea or capture them or just kill them. And they ironically question why God took them out of Egypt. And then they witness a great miracle and salvation, and they have the Az Yashir and the song, and that was something they even didn't do at the Exodus. There's no song recorded upon the Exodus. And then we get to an interesting part. It just throws in two psukim where we finally hear for the first time about Miriam, the prophetess, sister of Aaron, leads the women in song, and a critical verse, and all the women went out after her. Then we get to the stories, the first travels in the desert. The Jews encamp at a place that alludes to first the Torah, that's Marah. It talks about how God gave them laws there, Chazal say basic laws of keeping Shabbos and a few other ones. And then they end up in a place where there's 12 palm trees and 70 palm trees and 12 springs of water, a reference to the 70 elders and 12 tribal leaders. We have the parasha of the Mon, which is about how the Jewish people were provided with celestial bread and some meat. The aspect of the meat is basically said, yeah, they got meat in the morning, they got meat in the evening, and the bread, it has a long story about how the Jewish people were tested. Basically, they couldn't leave it over. They had to show that they depended on God on a daily basis to provide them with new manna, and that it also showed them when the Sabbath was to be observed. We also then have the Jewish people continue on their journeys. We're introduced to Joshua, and he's actually chosen by Moshe Rabbeinu. He's the one appointed Moshe Rabbeinu to lead the people in a battle against Amalek. And then at the end of the Parsha, it says this is a sign for the future. Yoshua is going to have to continue Israel's battles, and this is a foreshadowing that he'll become their leader. Then we get to D, which is Jethro, another non-Israelite. By the way, some connect Jethro's arrival. They contrast that with Amalek. Amalek and Jethro, they're both non-Jews. Amalek comes to attack the Jewish people because he hates us. And Yithro is impressed by all of God's miracles. So that's why he wants to join up with the Jewish people. I picked a bad color, I realized, for this because it's hard to read it. So he joins the Jewish people. I'd also like to say that there's a system of judicial slash leadership, a judicial slash leadership system. Why do I combine the two? Because basically in the olden days, a person in leadership was also a judge. It was assumed that the king, the chieftain, could be a court of appeal and could decide between disputing parties. And indeed, you see that there's some overlap, most importantly in the book of Judges. The book of Judges is basically a book of major leaders. They didn't actually sit down in a court and decide cases, but you see that there is that overlap. And also it says that certain kings would judge the people. It means they were governing the people, or they were acting as the providers for the people. And then we get to the last part. Israel arrives at Sinai, and God's proposal is brought for the leaders of the people. Be my people, and I'll be your God. And then the people actually get to meet God face to face. And starting with Numbers 10, 11, 36, which is, I think, in the fourth reading of Baal Uthecha, we see that the people depart Sinai. And once again, it tells you, we actually sing this, by the way, according to Minhag Ashkenaz. It says that the individual camps, there were 4 camps, with their leaders, began to march away from Sinai. And it begins again, Ve'al tziva'o, Nachshon ben Aminadav, Ve'al tzivah, Netanel ben Suar, and Al tzivah this. All the leaders are reiterated, and they are led by God's ark. And Moshe Rabbeinu has this prayer and all that. He's saying basically God's glory, represented by the ark and the pillar of cloud and fire, go ahead of the people. And then we get to a reflective part, which reflects D. See, the D's over here reflect, if you can see my cursor on the screen. Moshe Rabbeinu is sending off his father-in-law, a non-Jew. And we then read about how it's the non-Jews among the people, the Asaf Suf, because I'll equate them with the Erev Rav described in Parashath Bo. They're the ones who instigate all these problems. And Moshe Rabbeinu has to set up a new judicial slash leadership system, except this time his father-in-law is not involved. Before, it just says that he was trying to convince his father-in-law to stay, and Moshe Rabbeinu was stuck doing this. The next few verses correspond to what we have up here. Once again, a story about how the Israelites are complaining, and this time it's a little bit different. It talks about the man, but that's not the focus. The focus is the birds. The slav once again fall, but this time they're punished with the slav. It's an indicator of who's deserving of divine retribution. And in the middle of this, we're introduced again to Yehoshua, and instead he's interjecting himself. It says that he answered Moshe Rabbeinu, and he called out, he says, you should imprison these people for their rebellious actions. He was talking about Eldad Medad, and Moshe Rabbeinu instead rebuffs him. And Chazal add that at this point, Yoshua was basically trying to stand up for Moshe Rabbeinu because Eldad and Medad were predicting Moses' death and Joshua taking over for him. So there's a lot of reflection, certainly in this section, from that section. And then we get to another surprising story. Miriam tells her brother Aaron, once again, first time she's Miriam, the prophetess, sister of Aaron. Now it's Miriam is talking to her brother Aaron about how she believes that Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy isn't on necessarily a higher level. She says, "Halo gambanu diber." She's referring to herself and her brother Aaron, are also prophets just like Moses. And then the people are made to wait for her. Instead of following her in song, they're stuck with her in her, basically, she's excommunicated for a week. And the people all have to wait for her this time, instead of her leading the people. And then we get to the people getting to the edge of the Holy Land, the sin of the spies. And there's another recapitulation there. The people arrive at the edge of the Holy Land. It should have been a mere 3 days journey. It ended up taking many weeks. Instead of At the beginning, it was a short journey that ended up taking longer. Now it's a short journey, a long journey that should have been shorter. And they actually demand to turn back at the end because of the prospect of war. They're faced with the prospect of war, and they actually want to turn back. The threat this time is imaginary, and their question: we shouldn't have left Egypt. Why did God take us out of Egypt? Is actually serious. This time, it's not said with irony; it's said with they mean it. And therefore, God decrees all the men who saw my glory and my signs I performed in Egypt in the wilderness, which is of course a reference to also the splitting of the sea, will now have to pay for their lack of faith and gratitude. Then we have an epilogue at the end of Baal U'Techa, which also describes commandments that the Jewish people have to keep when they get to the land of Canaan. And once again, we get the ubiquitous part of the Jewish uniform. There's tefillin and tzitzit. I can't imagine something else that the Torah commands that we wear specifically in order to distinguish ourselves. Yarmulke doesn't count. That's not something that we're told to do by the Torah. That's just the midat chasidut. And so this is something that I think is worth reading over. You'll see that basically the story of Yithro is inserted here, even though it doesn't really, it's inserted over here, D. And once we put this in here, we have a complete, like I said, chiastic recapitulation of most of what's described after the Exodus until the giving of the Torah. That's in this half, and it's basically reversed in what we're reading now. So this is the thematic connection between what we are reading in the 3-year cycle and what everybody else is reading in the 1-year cycle. Now stop that. And now we have to give some context to what we've seen, because when the Torah gives such detailed description of something, you have to understand it. The first is a progression. The Jewish people left Egypt. We have a goal. The goal is to come to the promised land, but before that, we have to get to Mount Sinai and learn to keep the Torah. The Torah, as we saw last time we were discussing this, the Torah is the key. The Torah is the rule book for how to live in the land of Israel and stay there. Without the Torah, you cannot make it to the land of Israel. You can get in there, but you won't know what to do, and you'll get thrown out just like the Canaanites were. So there is a progression. We're working our way up. And Baal U'Techa is the regression. The last we hear from the generation of the Exodus is the incident of Korach, Dathan, and Aviram, and how the people eventually challenged Moshe Rabbeinu's authority. That generation was righteous. They took a major leap of faith. They put the blood of the Egyptian gods on their doorposts. They risked their lives. At least they thought they were risking their lives, an act of rebellion. And they followed God out into the desert. What the prophet describes that as Jewish people were like a young bride following their groom, a major act of love and commitment out into the desert. And the problem was that first generation was actually found sorely lacking. They were not prepared for war. The Rambam has a lot about this in more Nevuchim. They had to be taught how to think differently. The first generation just could not do it. It had to die. And a new generation had to be raised in the wilderness that was willing to fight. There are many midrashim about this idea, about this theme. It's alluded to also in a few very specific and the longer chapters of the Psalms. The Psalms actually have a few contrasting Psalms. That is, they describe what was going on in Jewish history before the Davidic Revolution. I'd call the Davidic Revolution a pattern that Chazal realized would have to be repeated. The Jewish people were comfortable in the land of Israel for a long time. The Jewish people had entered the land of Israel hundreds of years before David's time. They had a temple. They had leadership that was technically, as we described before, leadership that was technically kingdoms. The Shofet or the Navi stands in place of the king, and that's totally fine. That's perhaps what God wanted. But they became too complacent, and there was too many acts of idolatry, backsliding. People even became too familiar with the sanctuary and the presence of God's Ark of the Covenant. The last thing we read about before it was captured by the Philistines in the Churban Shilo, the sanctuary at Shilo being destroyed, was that the people were actually treating the Ark of the Covenant like a talisman, like an idol. They thought, oh, it's here, God's with us, we can't lose. And that was quite primitive in their thought, and they needed to be taught a lesson. So David led a revolution. David became chosen. From now on, leadership will stay in one family, and God's sanctuary will stay in one place. Jerusalem was chosen also. That was a revolution. Those were revolutionary ideas in Judaism, but they needed to happen. And we get to these revolutions very slowly. It takes perhaps decades before people realize what's going on. So there was a revolution also in Moshe Rabbeinu's time. They needed to change the way they think, and we see that there's this downfall. We haven't really gotten to that point yet in the book of Bamidbar, where we see the contrast between the Jewish people in the first generation and second generation, but it's there, it's alluded to in the verses. In these particular Psalms, which God willing we'll talk about, we'll see them in depth, they are actually describe what Jewish life was like before David showed up and what it was like afterwards. He basically refers a lot, just like in the later books of the prophets, the king of the 10 tribes, the rebel kingdom, is referred to as Ephraim because that was the dominant tribe. David HaMelech and other psalmists like Asaph refer to the time of the judges also as the time of Ephraimitic, what's the demonym for Ephraim, whatever it might be, or Josephian dominance of the Jewish people, as exemplified by the fact that the sanctuary was right in the middle of the territory of the dominant Joseph tribes. So we needed this revolution to take place. By the way, someone asked, where's the concept, which is very, I think it's maybe once or twice only in the Talmud, but it's certainly in later rabbinic literature and Kabbalistic literature. The idea we have of a Messiah is basically the pattern of King David. King David shows up on the scene. He saves the Jewish people from all their enemies. He establishes a firm Jewish kingdom. He decides where the temple is to be built. And the Messiah we're waiting for, the Mashiach ben David, the Davidic Messiah, will basically be of that model. So where do we get the Mashiach ben Yosef? Where does that concept come from? That's the Joshua model. Joshua was basically the king of the Jewish people from the tribe of Ephraim, the leader of basically the united house of Joseph. And he conquered the land of Israel. He was the one who first apportioned the land of Israel to the Jewish people and established the sanctuary at Shilo. So the sages basically have this principle, Ma'aseh Avot Siman Levanim, that which happened to the fathers is important for the children. So basically our redemption, in God willing, it's already taking place in front of us. The redemption will also follow a certain pattern. There'll be a leader of the caliber of Joshua, someone from Shevet Yosef, who will establish a Jewish commonwealth, so to speak, and sort of begin the process of establishing the sanctuary, but it won't be complete. He'll be an incomplete monarch. Perhaps he won't have a crown like Joshua. He won't be succeeded by his son. And whatever he establishes religiously will have a temporary nature, just as also exemplified by the Shilo sanctuary, which was basically a stone edifice with a tent on top. And the Mashiach ben David will be more of the Davidic pattern as I previously described. When I read Parashath Yithro, I see that the system that Yithro introduced, even though it came after the Torah was given, Moshe Rabbeinu was now teaching the people Torah, it's a critical part. Yithro was basically trying to tell us that you can't just have one teacher. You have to have a system. There has to be a hierarchy. It's not that every single question about milk and meat and perhaps Shabbos goes straight to the chief rabbi. It can't work that way. He would have no time for major ideas. Instead, we have to have the system, and because this system is I think Reb Gabriel, you gave the analogy of the hardware and the software. There's the software and the hardware, correct? The Torah.
It's the Ravs Analogy.
Oh, okay.
I really borrowed it.
Fine. I didn't hear it from him, so I attribute it to you. But indeed, there is part of the system of Torah Sheba'al Peh is basically brought up in this week's parasha. That's what Yithro is introducing. And there was a breakdown. Moshe Rabbeinu, when he was stuck in Baal Lethecha, was basically left without the system of teaching the Torah. They had the Torah as it is. The people knew they were supposed to keep the Torah, and they're crying about it. They can't keep it, and Moshe Rabbeinu needs the leadership to teach it. Part of Torah Sheba'al Peh is the discussion, the fact that there's someone you could go to ask your questions to. And when he doesn't know the answer, who does he go to? That's Rav Sherlow's Moses model. How do you know who the real Gadol Hador is? Gadol Hador, the greatest sage of the generation. When your Rav doesn't know the answer to a question, to whom does he turn? And when he doesn't know, to whom does he turn? So you could actually know that there was the Rav in Yerushalayim up until, let's say, last year, Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg. I have seen a lot of people bring their questions to him. Everybody knew that you ultimately end up with him. He was an Av based in Yerushalayim. And in Bnei Brak, there were certain Rabbanim. Until today, I don't think Rav Kanievsky, they treat him seriously as a gadol because it's usually the more flamboyant questions they're bringing to him, political things, or it's not really, they're not really expecting real answers from him. But there are, like, for example, Rav Karelitz, who has a real based in, who has to deal with the real questions that come to Bnei Brak. And in New York, it's been known for quite a few years. Before Rav Belsky passed away, he was sitting there with Rav Schechter every Friday at the OU's headquarters, and they were getting all the questions. Now Rav Schechter's sitting alone answering a lot of these questions. Even in the other yeshivas that aren't YU, they're asking him their questions. So you know who's sitting at the top of that pyramid. That's the system that we see there. I also welcome anybody else who can share some insights into this chiastic structure that we see that unites these two parshiot. And now if there are any questions, I guess it's time to address them. Is there anyone? No?
I do have a question. It's on the parsha, they're not on the chiastic structure. So I got two questions. First is grammatical.
Okay.
So, Posuk Kof, V'hizharta ethem et hachukim v'et hatoroth, and you shall warn them, or you shall announce, make known to them, or something like that, the statutes and the laws. So this thing V'hizharta ethem in place of otham. As far as is that the only place we find such a form? Aleph Tav.
I think that there are other places where it occurs. It's not the common one. I was writing before, for example, I don't want to take you off the subject, but there is, for example, Vayvarech ethem, Vayelech Vayeshev Lavan Mikumo. He blessed them, ethem. So Lavan uses that also. There's some uncommon examples. Normally, for example, we say his father in biblical Hebrew is Avihu. Remember this example? Aleph, Bet, Yud, Vav. And in like 7 examples that I found, it's Avihu. We actually write out the hey. There's as they say, an epenthetic hey. So this, is an uncommon word, but it does exist. I think there's also a few other times in Divrei Yomim where they use it. It's in Nehemiah. So it's there. It's not common, but it's grammatically, you're allowed to do it. By the way, sometimes when you have especially poetic sections, instead of lahem, you have lamo. The suffix ahem to them, or that makes them the object of something, is replaced with amo, and it's mil-el. You're familiar with that. Tita amo instead of tita aim, tita amo. So you've discovered an uncommon example. Oh, someone just sent to me one. He's harta et hem, vayishvaycharem et hem vet arihem. That's talking about that's just later in this book in Parashat Chukat. Wow. And we have in Sefer Yechezkel, there's the word ethem. So there's quite a few of them in there.
Okay.
And it's a perfectly valid, I don't know why they would do it that way, but it does exist, and it's a fair word.
It's just basically a synonym. There's no significance to using it. Okay. So the second question I have on the previous pasuk.
Okay.
So, now listen to my voice and I'll advise you. Wihi Elokim imach, and God should be with you. Heye ata la'am mul ha'elokim. You should be for the people as a intermediary or something like that to the God. So first of all, first question, why suddenly the definite article? Obviously sometimes you get a definite article on Elokim, but why at the beginning of the pasuk not here? Yes. And the second question, and you shall bring the words, the things, to the God. What is Moshe supposed to be bringing to Hashem? Why should he bring anything to Hashem? He knows the Lord.
Fine. So you're asking about that verb vayave. I just enlarged my own. I wanted to read along with you with the trop over here because I had shrunk it on my own screen to fit it there. And now I want to see specifically what you're referring to in that first part of the question. You were talking about the definite article before God.
So we get the Elokim comes up 3 times in the pasuk. First time, no definite article. Second and third time, definite article.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the second question is, when it says that you will bring the Devarim before the God.
Okay, so
what is Moshe Rabbeinu bringing?
So
Find a
the
good
first,
chat.
I'd like to say that I think, and now I'm going to go look at my concordance. My gut tells me that the second examples, you have Ha Elohim because there's a directional, and you can see that that's more common. Whenever there's a directional, one of the words like mul, el, etc., la, or you just have the prefix lamed, you're going to have a definite article. Whereas if there isn't one before that, there's no directional, a preposition or a prefix like this, then you're not going to have the definite article. And I'd like to check that out. That's what I think, and I'm just thinking through examples in my head, and that's what I see. It's not necessarily anything. It's not critical to say it, but that's basically how it works. When you zoveach lo Elohim yocharam, also referring to false gods, you see this. There's also that directional, the prepositional is there. With regards to this verb, you bringing the matters to God, to the God, or to just God, we should translate it as God. This is not uncommon. It's actually said also later in the book of Bamidbar, for example, Vayovei Moshe mishpatam lifnei Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu brought their matter before God a few times. So, by the way, I don't know what it means when Moshe Rabbeinu literally brings. Obviously, it's not a literal thing. When Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to commune with God, he would go to the Ol Moed, or perhaps before they constructed it, he would go to his tent outside the camp and meditate. That's basically what it meant. He could he could speak to God whenever he wanted. That's considered the uniqueness of his level of prophecy. So this apparently is the Hebrew idiom for when Moshe Rabbeinu would petition God on behalf of someone. Someone has a question, so he brings the question to God, which means he would sit and try to communicate. That's the best I could do. I mean, I think also, like I said, I'm also thinking of other examples where this is used, and that seems to be the case, that this is the proper verb to describe that. Just like vayikach, which has at the beginning of this parsha, we said last time, to take someone with words means to convince him. And that explains why does a man takes a woman as a wife, he has to talk her into it. He doesn't just, grab a wife or buy a wife. That's not what it means. It means he has to talk her into it, what you and I call courting, or like people who speak Old English used to call courting. That's basically how I see it.
No, I hear that. But my question is not on the verb lavi. My question is, what Yithro is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu is this: you can't judge every case yourself. You have to appoint judges, and you give them the general rules, and you say this is the halacha, and they judge the cases that are little or easy, whatever. And anything that's too hard for them, that's beyond their chokhmah, they bring to you. But they bring it to you. This pasuk seems to imply that it's a normal part of the judicial process. Moshe Rabbeinu will go to Hashem.
Yes.
But I was just surprised by reading it.
So Rambam actually explains this when the Sanhedrin was functioning and sitting in its proper place adjacent to the temple courtyard. Asking a question of them was like they stood in Moses' place, and what they decide to interpret in the Torah and to rule in a matter of halacha, that was as though it came down from Sinai. This explains, for example, the idea that people say, how do you have a halacha midoraitha, a biblical law that seems to have only been derived using exegesis sometime much later in history, like in Second Temple times? There's quite a few examples that the various researchers give, and they see this in the works of many Rishonim. And the answer is that there is a process of continuing revelation. Not necessarily, no prophet can do such a thing, except for Moses. The prophet's not allowed to say, oh, God just says do this, now this is the new interpretation. But the elders, a proper Sanhedrin functioning in its place, does have the capacity to bring down new Torah. New questions come up, and that's basically what Torah Sheba'al Peh is. According to Rambam's understanding, Torah Sheba'al Peh is a living interpretation of the Torah. And that's why a din can change, a particular halakha can change from generation to generation. You suddenly have a court that's considered wiser and greater in number, and they interpret this verse in an entirely different way, and the halakha is overturned. So that's what's going on here. There's always that reconsulting with God and finding out a new meaning that was perhaps hidden there the entire time. This is also alluded to, by the way, in the classic Midrash about Moshe Rabbeinu being shown Rabbi Akiva sometime in the future. Rabbi Akiva is deriving halachot by just looking at the horn, no, the spikes, the little what's the word here? The little thorns, the crowns on the letters, and he's deriving this. And Moshe Rabbeinu himself is puzzled, and he says, "No, this is how the Torah works. This is a living Torah. You could technically go back to the source at any given time if you use the proper methods." At least that's how it seems to me. That's what he's trying to say. This is a critical part of the system of Torah Sheba'al Peh. There's consulting with the elders. There's conversation, and then there's the part where the one who's sitting at the top can basically reconsult with the very source of the Torah itself, which is actually kind of amazing when you think about it. Does that make sense?
It's a good picture.
Well,
no, it's something to think about. It's something to think about.
I mean, that's at least how I understood it. Moshe Rabbeinu consults with God. Sometimes he has a question. Remember, I just said who sits. There's a few times in the Torah where there's a question. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, I'll consult with God. In the future, a Navi or a sage cannot hope for prophetic revelation to answer a tough question. Instead, what's the rule? People think like, oh, there's halachic conundrums today. How are we supposed to deal with the Temple Mount? We don't have psak in certain things. New questions come up. The answer is you have to sit down of a Sanhedrin of 71 and you discuss the din, and then you take a vote. And 36 say this and 35 say that. The halacha follows 36. So sometimes there's a question and the ultimate decision. There's no such thing as a Sanhedrin getting to a teku. Talmudic sages get to teku. They don't decide. They can't. They don't know what to do. That there's no such thing as a Sanhedrin having a teku. The Sanhedrin has the ultimate answer. They put it to a vote. And that's what God says the halacha is, because he endorsed their vote. In this case, though, Moshe Rabbeinu is fundamentally different, like we learned in Baha'u'llah, by the way. That's what Miriam had to realize. Moshe Rabbeinu speaks directly to God, and perhaps that's the best way to do it. But if you don't have a Moshe Rabbeinu, you're already a Joshua, so you have to sit with the elders and have a discussion and then take a vote, and that will be the answer, and the ultimate answer with which no one may, what's the Quran? It starts with a C-O-N. Oh, I'm forgetting my words here. Constitutional law. Dissent. No one can dissent. Or at least someone could dissent in theory. He could tell the people, I still think you're wrong, but in practice, he must follow what their ruling is. Yeah. Okay. And if that's all, I thank everybody for joining. Don't forget, like, share, and subscribe. Check out the websites and send in your questions or comments. And I look forward to speaking to you gentlemen again. Have a good night. Peace be upon you.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.